for the second session for the CPP 2021 conference. This session is titled Justice and Punishment, and it will go from now until 12:30 my time, because I'm in West Virginia. So by way of introductions, my name is Maria del Guadalupe Davidson, and I am a Woodburn Professor of Women's and Gender Studies at West Virginia University. I'm also Associate Dean for Social Justice, Faculty Development and Innovation as well, and so that's a pretty cool job. I'm really happy to introduce you to our speakers for today, and please forgive me if I mispronounce your names. Please help me with your names. So our first speaker is Zachary Click from the University of Rochester, pronouns they, them, and Zachary will be speaking about proportionate punishment. And our second speakers are Amin Asfari, is that correct? Okay, Amin is from Wake Tech College. Is that in Texas as well?
That is in North Carolina.
Ah, North Carolina, very nice. And our second speaker is Amni.
Sorry, it's Amin and Amni.
Okay, Amni. Okay, Amin and Amni. Amni, is it Sharadi?
Sharadi, yeah.
Sharadi. Okay. And Amni will be speaking about, the title of their paper is Veils of the Ignorant, a Rawlsian critique of flawed criminal justice policies in the 21st century. And if it's okay with the speakers, can we just run through both of your papers and then have questions at the end, or would you prefer to have questions after you present? How would you like to do this?
That will be okay with us.
Time? Okay, very good. I'm going to keep time, and if everyone else could just have themselves muted during this time, that would be great. So Zachary, you have the virtual floor.
Excellent. Let me see, am I able to share a screen with you, share a PowerPoint? I think right now it's showing me that it might be disabled, but that's all right. If it's not something that we can do, I can.
Host of the Zoom, and then you might be able to share.
Okay, should I be able to do that? Okay, so, and this is where you all, okay, multiple participants can share. Try now, please.
Okay, there we go. I think it's working. Thank you so much.
Yep.
All right. So, hi everyone. Thank you for having me here. I'm really excited to give this presentation and hopefully to get some thoughts from you as well. So before I start into the presentation proper, I want to do two things. Number one, I want to give you my strategy and what I'm doing in this paper, just lay the ground a little bit. And number two, I want to make a whole bunch of disclaimers that I think are very important for understanding what this project's doing. So, number one, this paper broadly, or this presentation broadly, is about proportionate punishment. And I'll explain what that is in the course of the presentation. What I want to do is start from a very easy intuition that I hope everyone's going to agree with. And if you don't, I'm really interested to see why not when we get to questions. But I want to go from something I want everyone on board with, and then make some conclusions and hopefully give us something interesting to talk about that you might not have expected, or at least seems like most people don't expect. So that's the strategy, intuition to interesting conclusion. The second part I wanted to add are some disclaimers. I'm going to be talking about punishment, and I'm going to be talking about a very narrow facet of punishment that is largely about classism in punishment. I'm going to be idealizing away from a lot of things that are going on. I do not take as an assumption that our current practices are at all just. I don't take as an assumption that any of the ideals that I'll be having going on in the background actually obtain. Instead, I'll be saying, even if we fixed all of the many, many, many things that are problematic about our justice system, we would still have a problem if we don't adjust for what I'm going to be talking about. So let's jump into it. Here's my starting intuition. A quote from my mom. $1,000 is like a penny to a millionaire. Well, there's something right about that. Depending on how much wealth you have, a given cost or a loss, it's going to impact your life differently. I think we can all see how that is fairly intuitively, but just in case, let's label some cases and see what we think. So imagine my good friend Sasha has a grand total of $1,000. That's all she has to her name. As a matter of pure misfortune, Sasha loses those $1,000, leaving her with absolutely nothing. Case number two, Bob has a grand total of $1 million. As a matter of misfortune, Bob loses $1,000. Uniform, the same loss that Sasha took. Now Bob ends up with 999,000. I think intuitively we can all see Bob is in a much better place, and that loss has impacted Bob significantly less than it has Sasha, right? Sasha is left destitute. Bob's still pretty well off, rich, you might say, right? So what explains the difference in these impacts? We've got our intuitive cases before us. We've got something we're looking for. What explains these differences? How could we eventually set these values to be equal or to have an equal impact on these different persons and their different wealth status? Well, one way would be to look at the final value. We could say, well, look, if Bob lost just as much or lost enough wealth to fall down to exactly the same level as Sasha, well, they both end up with $0. That seems like they're both destitute now, so maybe we've figured out what's going on. Well, it's a little bit tricky though. We're looking for impact, and we're looking for a principle that explains how the impact varies based on wealth. But if we think carefully about this, we would have to go the other way too and be the same. So say Bob loses 1,000 and ends up with 999,000. Well, how could we set, from Sasha's perspective, something equal? Well, we could give Sasha a lot of money in order to get all the way up there from 1,000 to 999,000. Well, that doesn't look like an equal impact, at least. It does look like there's something equal in terms of the outcome. Now they're both just as well off in life or something like that. But in terms of analyzing the effect on their life of those losses, that's different. Bob lost something and Sasha gained something. Those just are different for their well-being and their lives, right? So I think we should go on to another proposal to analyze impact of loss. And we should do that with proportionality. To understand the difference in the impact, what would be a more or less equitable loss, we can calculate the proportion of their wealth that's lost. So Sasha lost $1,000 out of $1,000. Pretty easy to tell, that's 100% of her wealth. Bob lost 1,000 out of $1 million. That's only 0.1% of Bob's wealth, right? To make these cases equally impactful or to find out what an equal impact loss might look like, one thing we could do is insist on matching up those percentages, the loss relative to the total wealth, right? So to make the cases equal, we could have Bob lose 100%, that'd be all $1 million to match Sasha. Or going the other direction, we could have Sasha just lose 0.1%, $1. This is a little bit more promising, and it looks like now we can go either direction with this without running into obvious problems for the theory or for the principle, right? Why does this matter for us? This paper, I've laid my cards on the table already. This paper's about punishment, so how are we getting there? Well, let's start with the easier case of monetary punishment. So far, I've hoped to show something that I think you all probably agreed with before I said anything, which is that uniform losses are not equally impactful, and that partially depends on your wealth status. So we should expect that uniform losses brought about by punishment as well are also going to be, they're also going to fail to be equally impactful. They're disparate. Just for a fun toy example to look at, let's take New York State speeding tickets. The penalties for inappropriate speed or speed up to 10 miles per hour over the speed limit are as follows. The minimum fine is $45, the maximum is $150. We're not going to worry about how we determine what's in between just yet. We're just going to consider how these work. Well, one way we could do this is look at the present minimums. And just because I like names, I've given people different names in this case. So Trixie lives right at the US federal poverty line for single persons. You can see that number up there, $12,880 per year income. A loss of that minimum speeding ticket, $45 for Trixie, is a loss of roughly 0.4% to 0.5%. It's right in between there of her annual income. Katya, on the other hand, who makes $518,400 per year, which is the threshold for the highest US tax bracket, for receiving that same equivalent speeding ticket, Katya is going to lose less than 0.01% of her annual income. Now, as we've seen, this is a different impact. This is affecting these people differently, right? In order to equalize it, we need to fine Katya over $2,000 for that speeding ticket. Right? Of course, the upper limit for the sort of New York State speeding ticket is only 150, as we already saw. Now, there's two things to note here. One is, well, that shows us right away what we have, even in a simple, easy case of speeding tickets, just does not account for the difference in wealth and how our punishment of imposing a fee is going to affect people's lives. It's very different here. Now, another response you might have to this is like, oh yeah, but you know what, $2,000 is excessive for poor Katya. Like, sure, she's rich and all, but that's a lot of money for a little speeding ticket, even up to 10 over. Well, yeah, maybe. But then so is $45 for Trixie. And that's one of the things I want to accomplish using this sort of simple analysis, right? If you think $2,000 is too much for a speeding ticket, you should also think that in Trixie's case, in our person right at the federal poverty line, it's too much for them too, right? Now we could go the other direction and we could try to preserve the maximums. There's some problems with this I'll get to. But just to finish out our analysis here, the current maximum's $150. That's 0.03% of Katya's wealth. She's the rich one. Taking that as our starting point, we could scale the other direction and see how we should find Trixie, who's right at the poverty line. Well, she should only be given a fee of $3.73 if we're going to preserve the impact and the proportion here. That's quite a bit lower than our minimum of $45. Now, first thought you might have, that's a pretty low fee. Maybe that's not meaningful. Whatever this punishment stuff is supposed to accomplish, will that do it? That's kind of an open question that I'm not going to answer here. But if you do think it's too low, then you should also think that the 150 maximum for Katya is too low as well, right? There's another reason I'd be worried about doing things based on setting a maximum for the highest payer, which is it's not clear why people won't gain additional wealth beyond that. It seems like we certainly allow it, so it's hard to set a maximum without also having a wealth cap. But setting that aside, I think we've illustrated the point here. These sort of monetary punishments are unequal as it stands, but we could make them equal if we did this. This also gives us a way to analyze why these fees are they're literally disproportionate to people's wealth. So disproportionately impact the poor using these monetary fees if we leave them uniform, even if they're always applied correctly, even if you only ever got a fee for something you really did and you really deserve some punishment. Both of those are open questions in general. But even if it was applied correctly, it's still going to be unfair just on the basis of your wealth level. Right? Now, of course, all of you may be thinking, well, hold on. Fines aren't the only way we punish. In fact, it might not even be the most important or most worrying way in which we do punish. You'd be right. Incarceration is pretty worrying too. Probation, putting people under surveillance, forcing them to do community service. So what about those things? Does this extend? Are these things going to affect people differently as well based on their level of wealth? I think the obvious answer is yes. And I think there's been a lot of past work that shows this. Right? So how's it different? Well, I'm just going to quickly move through these to make sure we're staying on track here time-wise. But here's one way. The wealthy typically continue to accrue wealth while they're in prison. Right? They have various resources, stocks, businesses, properties, things of that nature, that will continue to, in fact, keep earning them more resources, even whenever they don't have direct access to them or can't use them in all the ways they might like to. Similarly, when people are incarcerated, this affects their job prospects. Having a criminal record is pretty serious for that. And for the wealthy, that doesn't impact them as much. One, because they need jobs less as a means to survival, but two, the kinds of mechanisms for earning money and for getting jobs they can rely on or they can turn to, just having a criminal record doesn't matter as much for them. That can be things like because of networking, that can be because you simply own the business, things like that. Similarly, for criminal records in education, can bar you from certain institutions or at least be a mark against you. Right? Now, some institutions have tried to account for this, but let's set that aside for now. There's additional features I do want to highlight as important, but I'm not going to discuss in detail. That's that when we do move to take someone to trial or we're going to potentially incarcerate them, there's often a bail that's set. And the poor typically are unable to pay that, or very often are, especially with a very common practice among judges of deliberately setting bail very, very high for people of lower classes. Right? And that's going to result in earlier and additional incarceration. This adds an additional pressure as well on people to force them to plead guilty, to move people through the system more rapidly, and without even giving them a proper trial. These are also going to be intensifying factors, but we're not going to discuss them in detail here, but you can bring them up in the questions if you like. Now, one thing you'll have noticed in that discussion, I left something out. All I talked about were monetary components of incarceration, right? How being imprisoned is going to affect your wealth or your potential for wealth accrual and things like that. And I think that's very important. But there's other non-monetary impacts as well. And that's going to lead us to a bit of a puzzle here in a moment. The non-monetary impacts can be things like the possibility of pursuing your projects, the capacity of loved ones visiting without hardship. Now, the wealthy are going to be more likely to access even these things, even though they'll still lose them to a degree. That can be because they can use their money to accomplish goals outside of the prison system. It can be because their loved ones are more likely to be able to visit them because they can afford it, essentially. But I take it as a point that some of these features aren't going to be, even on a proportionate model, quite accounted for. Neither the rich nor the poor get to do what they want with their day when they're imprisoned, at least not in the same way that they otherwise would. They're not going to be able to spend time around the people that they care most about. Certainly, you're not going to be able to, in the same way, to develop your talents, hobbies, etc. So, what gives, right? We've seen already, just if my arguments hold up, and I think they do on empirical data, well, there is something that favors the wealthy, even in incarceration, but it maybe isn't quite the same as the monetary case. So what can we do? And this is a puzzle that I'm interested in solving because I think it's clearly unjust to just use uniform punishment on the poor and the wealthy, monetary or non-monetary. So option one's bite the bullet and say, well, the wealthy's additional suffering from incarceration, not being able to pursue their projects, sure, proportionality might overpunish a little or make look like it, but that's just not what we care about. We're going to do it anyways to make sure that we are getting closer to something like actual equitable treatment. Right? Option number two, say that punishments like incarceration can never be justified, precisely because we can't possibly account for these sorts of things and make them equitable. I mean, this would be really good news if you're a prison abolitionist, for example. Option number three, we can add a monetary component onto all punishments, including incarceration, perhaps reducing incarceration as well, and set that at some lower value for those who are poorer, and let that scale based on wealth. Right? That would at least allow there to be some uniform component and then adjust for the injustice that I've talked about, the advantage of the wealthy in this circumstance, by adding on something that does scale. We could talk more about that maybe in the questions and answers. Option number four is we could find another element related to wealth that would require the wealthy to in fact receive more impactful punishment than their poorer counterparts. That seems actually plausible to me, but more work would have to be done there. That could have to do with social responsibility, excuse or need. So for example, someone who commits a crime, say related to stealing something. If they're poor and do it, it might be out of necessity. It might be really well favoring how they can live their lives. Whereas for the wealthy, it seems like they really just don't need that extra, however much they took. So maybe there's additional guilt in that sense. That's another discussion, but I think that's at least one proposal for figuring out how to get past this puzzle. So here's the quick version of the conclusion. Punishments, both monetary and non-monetary, impact people's lives differently depending on how much wealth they possess. In order to account for this, I think we're going to need to modify our practices quite substantially in order to account for this. And we need to do it based on those who we convict wealth. Again, this is setting aside all of the other worrying features about punishment and all of the unjust ways that it is in fact implemented. We might think about the state of affairs right now. Right now, we actually punish the poor far more harshly than we punish the wealthy for similar crimes. And we in fact favor the wealthy even in far more severe crimes. So I think with that, I have one last thing to say before I wrap up and we move on to the question segment, which is you may be worried about one other feature. I've talked about proportionality as a strict percentage of wealth. That might not capture everything, right? For example, if we're talking about really extreme amounts of money, right? It may be that even if you lost the proportionate amount, you're still better off. I think that's plausible. And I just would like to quickly forward two ways that I've been thinking over in my head to account for that. One is to include an account of marginal utility, which would say that as you increase in wealth, its impact on your well-being diminishes. And what we could say then is that you need to go beyond proportionality. You need to punish the wealthy more than what would just be strictly percentage-wise proportionate in order to effectively make the punishments equal in impact. I think that's a pretty reasonable way to go. Alternatively, you could also take up something like Martha Nussbaum or Amartya Sen's capabilities approach and point to all these various ways in which having that wealth changes your capability to do things in the world, similarly with incarceration, the way that impacts your capabilities. taking up a more complex analysis on those lines, I suspect will allow us to get even better than just the simple proportionate account. And I only mean the proportionality account in the form I've offered it here, to paint us a picture of why we need to make these changes and why we need further analysis to look at exactly how much we need to do to repair this. With that, I'm going to stop there. Thank you all for listening. I'll go ahead and stop sharing the screen.
Thank you so much, Zachary. And so I think we'll just move right into our next presentation.
Hi, colleagues, and thank you. I'm Amin Asfari. Welcome and thank you for being here. I will not take much of your time, about 15 minutes, and I'll leave some time for my colleague, Emni Shredi, who will follow thereafter. Let me first see if I can share my screen here. I'm assuming you can see it at this point. Okay. Oh, I want to do that. Okay. So what we're talking about today is essentially what we call the veils of the ignorant, a Rawlsian critique of flawed criminal justice policies in the 21st century. And in hindsight, what the title should reflect is really the focus of our paper, which is CVE policing, which is countering violent extremism. And as you'll see, let me briefly walk you through the layout of the presentation. What I'd like to do is to walk you through understanding what CVE policing strategies are. We're going to evaluate the effects of those policing strategies on minority communities through various lenses, namely criminological, sociological, and critical theoretical perspectives. We would like to connect those current CVE policing practices to broader historical and political trends that have taken place. And then we would like to apply a sort of a Rawlsian critique and review the ways in which marginalized communities can cooperate to challenge the flawed policy outcomes. So what are CVE policing practices? The problem, of course, is that they're conceptually ambiguous to define. They are often mistakenly compared to community policing efforts, which stemmed from the 1990s. In the 1990s, there were efforts made to really bridge the gap or to close the social distance between the communities, namely African American and Hispanic communities, who had just been rendered decimated by the war on drugs. Close that social gap and the social distance between them and the police through a principle put forth by Sir Robert Peel, one of the founders of modern policing in the UK long ago, who essentially argued that the public are the police and the police are the public, and in so doing, that they are that there's a symbiotic and mutual relationship, mutually beneficial relationship. CVE policing, on the contrary, doesn't do that. CVE policing focuses heavily on ideologies, as you see there. The attempt is to stop the radicalization of people, preventing them from becoming terrorists. But the problem is that the emphasis is on ideologies, not on actual acts. And thus it blurs the line between free speech, hate speech, and speech to incite violence. Behavior is not at the forefront of this policy, merely ideology. Here, this is taken from the University of Maryland, which has a repository of information and a database that tracks everything extremism related. And here, this was a study that was done looking at the traditional community policing versus CVE policing and making comparisons between the two in terms of their outcomes and their intents. And I'm going to highlight very quickly some of the practice domains that you see there and some of the problems that we see with them. I'm not going to go through all of them, but some of them. With respect to, for example, the engage component, where we look at the engagement with community members. We know that the target is often Muslims, and that tends to be rather discriminatory. There, it's quite clear what CVE policing, what group is being targeted. When we look at willing and cooperative community leaders, what that tells us that it essentially is counterproductive because it tends to embed suspicion and further alienate the youth, making who tend to be more susceptible to say militant or extremist ideologies. And it's many studies have shown that these institutions, i.e., the Islamic centers and the mosques and so forth, are the very bastions of security, where these places and the places where these youth tend to be de-radicalized, and so alienating them from these spaces tends to be counterproductive. With regard to the second practice domain, educate, this notion of promoting knowledge and awareness and law enforcement and law enforcement understanding of history, culture, and community. The problem there, of course, is we've seen historically that the use of propaganda and poor vetting of speakers has been used, often done by non-Muslims and so-called terrorism experts to come in and to train law enforcement officers, essentially further perpetuating the idea of Muslims as the other, further perpetuating the idea that they are somehow, that there's an indelible feature about them that makes them fundamentally more prone to extremist ideologies. And further ingraining in their mind essentially the need that they need more CVE policing practices. The idea of partner, right? Trust and historical trauma. This tends to be rather vague. Money in the bank, the next point, is rather counterproductive to building the trust, the aforementioned trust. We note Mother Jones' diary has done extensive work on this that looks at the use of agent provocateurs. And this is, of course, not new with minority communities. This has been done, if we go back to Joseph Gusfield's symbolic crusade in regards to Catholics and Protestants. And we look at the use of agent provocateurs and the use of the prohibition, essentially, by the Protestant majority against the Catholic minority. Subsequently, we look at the war on drugs, similar agent provocateurs, and the use of payments for them to essentially go and undermine the trust within those communities, essentially the use of spies. Of course, of note is the collaboration between the NYPD and the CIA in New York to engage in spying and the mapping out of Muslim communities in New York, which was later exposed. The notion of problem solve, help communities assess levels of risk. Well, for non-Muslims, that's rather subjective and based in stereotypes and fear. When we say help communities, what do we mean? Non-Muslims don't understand, don't have the cultural competence to understand Muslim culture, Muslim inclinations, and so on and so forth. So those tend to be based on, again, stereotypes, media framing, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And for the Muslims, it assumes that they're somehow infantilized, that they are that they can't themselves take care of themselves, and or that they can't report and don't know how to administer their own affairs. Risk mitigation, make the environment hostile to violent extremism. This assumes, again, the otherwise that this assumes otherwise of Muslim communities, that extremism is somehow endemic to these communities, but no similar assumption is made of non-Muslim communities. So, for example, you wouldn't see these kinds of efforts done at the local Baptist church or the Methodist denomination and so forth, right? Lastly, organizational change tends to be rather vague. And the last measure there, practice domain measure tends to be rather problematic, and here's why. So if you look at some of the assessments, this idea of partnering with academics to engage in research and about the Muslim community, about extremism, problematic assessments that are often ahistorical and contribute to the labeling of Muslims the hyper-focus on the Muslim terrorist or extremist subject. Consider the use of recent brain scan studies conducted on Pakistani British citizens, where researchers measured changes in brain activity, brainwave activity, when subjects were made to hear comments in support of Iraq or Afghan invasions, or in some way related to the subject's faith, some derogatory comments. These studies are often funded by troubling sources, the Department of Justice, and so forth. And they're often ahistorical, failing to concatenate the complex and nefarious geopolitical agendas that led to the wars. So who's affected by CVE policing? Well, Muslims and Arabs, obviously, largely, and others deemed as such if you consider phenotype. And I include here a photo of this child, the perfect Aryan child. Now, this child, her name is Hessie Levinsons, about 80 years old now, in her 80s rather. She is actually not a white child. She was used as a perfect Aryan child. This is a propaganda poster by the German Nazis. Turns out that she's Jewish. And that's the problem with leaving these kinds of programs up to the communities to engage in. So who is targeted by these kinds of policies, especially when we let the community at large do our work for us, i.e. the government's work, your teachers, your doctors, and so on. This gentleman here is a relative of mine. He is Dia Barakat. He was shot and killed in 2015. For those of you who know anything about the Chapel Hill shootings, this is the one of the three who were killed. He was never harassed by his neighbor, not until his wife appeared on the scene. That's his wife and her sister. He was never harassed because his phenotype doesn't fit the standard Muslim image. But when his wife appears on the scene, of course, donning the hijab or the traditional head covering, that's when things become problematic. And thus, it is the phenotype that leads to the discrimination. Thus, the government essentially acts in similar ways as the white supremacist. It targets and teaches the community to target individuals based on phenotype using this program of CVE policing. Without being verbose here, let me just walk you through a brief synopsis of how this happens. CVE policing relies on perceptual shorthand of observers, whether that's law enforcement who are mistrained by these so-called terrorism experts, or by individuals like the teachers, the friends, the neighbors, etc., who essentially become the eyes and ears of government. We use a couple of theories to undergird our paper. The first comes from a troubling source, Miller, in 1962. Miller comes from the Chicago School of Criminology, which is a set of theories in criminology that focus heavily on the subculture as the antecedent for criminal behavior. Here, traits like excitement, toughness, smartness, autonomy, etc., are said to be the coping mechanisms that are developed to deal with inner city life. Essentially, blacks and Hispanics and poor whites, their criminality is explained not by the sociological or other factors, the systemic factors that led to their criminal behavior. No, it's something endemic about them. It's their toughness, their culture, the way that they're brought up to deal with the conditions in which they are find themselves. Applied broadly to Muslims, we see that the homogenizing principles, such as the jihad trait, which is coined by Bat Yor in her famous book, incidentally used by white supremacists, called Eurabia, becomes popularized. The idea is the jihad trait is something endemic about them, and that's the focus of CVE policing, that they're extreme somehow. Then media framing, Goffman, frame analysis, that they're framed in the media as such, that they're always violent and so forth. And then, of course, all of that seeps down into the groups, which we see, we live in a multicultural society. And as such, we're competing with power differentials. Groups perceive a threat to their symbolic threats. They're not speaking our code, they're not speaking our language, or they're costing us money in terms of healthcare and education. And those dynamics come into play. It builds animus, it builds prejudice. Post 9/11, we see the heightened fear and the sensationalized Muslim violence compared to non-Muslim violence, over 770% in terms of the media framing when a Muslim engages in an act of violence or, let's say, terrorism, as opposed to a non-Muslim in terms of the coverage. Now, Foucault tells us, well, that's quite natural. Here we're looking at Foucault's governmentality, this notion of decentralizing of power. Take away the power of the government to punish, and you make distinctions between the good Muslim and the bad Muslim. The good Muslim is the one who is the Muslim in the military, who uses violence, but does so to further the aims of the American empire. But the bad Muslim is the one who uses violence for other means. And there, the teacher, the neighbor, etc., have to look for those signs. And again, here it's ideology. It's not necessarily actions. But in the context of actions, we see what can arise, what kind of troubling events arise. Ahmed, the clock boy who made a little clock and was perceived as a terrorist because of his little clock. The UPenn professor who was kicked off a plane for doing a mathematical equation. Incidentally, here he was using Arabic numerals to his fault. And of course, this happens with Black children, and we know this for some time with regard to the school to prison pipeline. This is how framing happens. You see this nice little dog here. You've never interacted with this dog. You assume by virtue of the appearance that this is a violent dog. You've never actually encountered it. Maybe a nice dog, but this is your reaction due to the framing. It's a stereotype. Same thing here, right? You see this group. This is how you always perceive them, and the same is true for these communities. So the intersections are rather interesting. I'll give you a little scenario here. If an American of immigrant descent decried America as a terrible nation, lambasted its military, and showed great disdain for its institutions, would he or she be placed under surveillance or go on to be the next president of the United States? This is an interesting rhetorical question. The question becomes then, are we talking about similar behavior isn't deemed problematic when engaged in by whites. Now we're talking about behavior as opposed to mere ideology. Bombarded with such images of Black and brown bodies, what we see is the CJ system is not benign, and its activation comes from the underlying prejudices embedded within our society. I need not remind you all of these wonderful ladies who were prompted to call the police to essentially come and engage with Black citizens for sleeping on park benches, for barbecuing, for walking their dogs, and so on. So the activation of the criminal justice system is never a benign issue. So these kinds of policies do something, right? The activation of the criminal justice agencies is based on irrational fears, and the mere ideas, not actions of citizens, does the following to the communities most impacted. It further isolates those communities from the broader population. It sows distrust of the institutions of government. Most visible among them is law enforcement. It undermines legitimate efforts to work with the communities to create safe and inclusive spaces, and it further deepens existing cleavages in America's multicultural landscape. And let me say, with regard to John Rawls here, just for brevity, because I don't want to take from my colleagues' time, what we see is a globalized effort that these kinds of practices have taken shape all over the world. They've taken shape in Australia and the UK and elsewhere. CVE practices have existed in places where you have multiracial societies, where there exist strained race relations. Indeed, John Rawls says to us that's very problematic, because the very notion of justice, according to him, is that we engage in the policy development process behind the veil of ignorance, where we know nothing of ourselves and we know nothing of the people for whom we are developing policies, and that the policy should be should account for the lowest common denominator. To give an example, the Americans with Disabilities Act is a policy that is such a policy. It suggests that when I construct a building, I do so not knowing that I'm able-bodied or not knowing who that building is going to serve, and thus it needs to have both a ladder, stairs, and an elevator such that everybody has access to it. Emily?
Okay, so sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so given recent events in the last few years, couple years, we have given the example of connecting CV policing impacts on Black and Palestinian communities. So Black and Palestinian activists often have empathy, if not solidarity, with one another because of their shared experiences. Both groups are the victims of profiling, discrimination, and excessive surveillance. So for Muslims, these issues long predate 9/11, but that era represents a marked shift toward even greater and more outward instances of these practices. With the Black community, these issues far precede Black Lives Matter, but that kind of marks the big media coverage of the events in these instances. Revelations that certain police departments, such as Boston, and then more recently Los Angeles, just within the last couple months, even though this has been going on for at least 6 years, have been using social media hashtags, keyword tracking, and other technological techniques to surveil these communities, and have created concern and reopened discussions about privacy issues in the surveillance of people of color. So they use these hashtags such as, Black Lives Matter. The most recent one that was trending yesterday, I think, was Stand with the Six, which is the Palestinian activism hashtag. And so looking at things like this just to track these people on their public domain, even though it's, freedom of speech is legal, it's just the ideology. And so there's another thing called undercover friending. And so you have undercover officers no longer just going and selling drugs on the street or trying to befriend dealers or people of a certain color because they want to learn more about terrorist activities, but actually going and friending them on Facebook using fake personas. So it's a surveillance technique, and it has murky legality right now, but the information just isn't there in the books to determine whether it is truly illegal at this moment. These agencies seek to address potential threats or incidents before they occur. That's a quote from them. And they often hire outside companies to assist in data tracking and collection. So federal funding requests for this type of aid are often presented under the guise of terrorism prevention, but they can also be utilized during Black Lives Matter protests and to target activists. So this is even spread to the federal level, with the DEA using covert surveillance to target protesters, especially during the BLM protests. And they were granted an expansion of power for that purpose. The DEA is the drug enforcement agency, and so having them have permission essentially to make arrests of activism under the grounds of terrorism, even though it's not drug related, is branching outside of their normal realm of power or focus. So shortly after the death of George Floyd, discussions about US training in Israel and techniques in the US toward Black communities holding similarities to those overseas used against Palestinians began to unfold. While certain groups challenged the reports from numerous sources, including the Jewish Voice for Peace and the Middle East Eye as being misleading, the Jewish Virtual Library quotes officers involved in this type of training. And they stated that these workshops helped build skills in identifying terrorist cells, enlisting public support for the fight against terrorism, and coping with the aftermath of a terrorist attack. So the police are the front line of the battle. This is a quote. The police are the front line in the battle against terrorism. Oh, I'm not ready for these slides yet, but sorry. No, you're good. Against terrorism and coping with the aftermath of a terrorist attack. Sorry. The police are the front lines in the battle against terrorism, we were there to learn from them. Their response, their efforts to deter it. The program covered topics such as border security and media response during crises, as well as overviewing strategies for treating mass casualties, performing rescue operations, and establishing command and control at the scene of a terror attack. And so this sort of goes over the issue of how CVE policing relates in both of these communities. These issues are similar to the tactics outlined by CVE policing, which affects both communities. Both communities, though they cannot be homogenized historically, have been marginalized and are victims of the impacts of colonization and have been labeled as extreme when they speak up about their humanity or call for an end to being targeted. So I need that table that was after my first slide. Yes. So if you look at this table, just highlighting some of the different the different government agencies and what they look at for CVE policing. So 2006, you see, it's just very blatant, wearing Muslim attire, growing facial hair. So even if it's a brown man with no Muslim connections, having a beard and being near a mosque could put him up for surveillance. Having the ideology, beliefs, and values, or the notion that the West poses threat to a group under 2015. The us versus them, the concerns about discrimination in the US, that last one, with feelings of grievance and injustice, a desire for political or moral change, that would directly address something like Black Lives Matter, as well as Palestinian activism, Muslim activism, and activism in other areas. To the next slide, please. You see that there's a research gap, and this is a the Department of Homeland Security's piece, in domestic communities. So domestic terrorism cells have a research gap. They haven't been studied. But as we know, the major impacts in with the Walmart shooting, the Ohio shooting, all of those in just a couple months of each other show that this is still a gap, even though this article was published in 2017. And you see from the FBI,
I'm sorry, you have about 2 more minutes, just that we can have time for discussion.
Yeah,
okay.
I'm almost done, yeah. Black identity extremists likely motivated to target law enforcement officers. So they refer to people who are protesting police violence as extremists, essentially. Next slide, please. So just to show some of the similarities, this is on the left, that is the US, on the right is Palestine, and below is also Palestine, but it's a Black Lives Matter protest. Next slide, please. These pictures are not in the US. These are all in the Palestinian territories. All of these George Floyd murals are actually in the West Bank and Gaza. And then they're comparing one of the Palestinian victims to George Floyd's situation. Next slide. This photo with this Palestinian flag is actually taken in Cleveland. And so this speaks to the solidarity and the connections that they feel with each other, because you can't really tell from these photos which is taking place where. And next slide, please. And this is art from a Palestinian cartoonist and then a American cartoonist. And it just shows you once again the connections. And this last slide kind of helps us wrap up here. These are the recommendations that the OJP, Office of Justice Programs, gives. And the main one is to stop using words like counter-violent extremism, to change target all communities instead of just Muslims and instead of just Black people. But these suggestions are also problematic in the sense that by renaming and expanding what this is, essentially we are still targeting Muslim communities and causing harm to Muslim communities, as well as Black communities and marginalized communities and people of color. And so while this might be a a good suggestion on the surface of, oh, let's change the name and expand this so we're not racial profiling and we're not doing these things, it's still problematic in that spreading the harm across different groups does not undo the harm done to one group.
Thank you so much. These are just two really excellent presentations. So we have two questions in the chat. The first question, Zachary, is for you. It's from Danielle. Great paper. When you get to questions, okay, blah, blah, blah. I'd love to know if there are places who have been implementing proportional punishments in the justice system.
Yes, great question also. There are to an extent. So some of the key places that are cited are Finland started doing this in the, I want to say the 20s, but they, like many others, don't do it completely for all forms of punishment. The one I'm most familiar with nowadays is Germany has something like this for fines, where the fines that are assessed are, I think it's like called a day unit is what it's usually translated to, which essentially means like a unit relative to an entire day's work of income for you. And so if you're assessed 1 day unit, then that's multiplied by your income. So you just pay basically 1 day of labor. And so on and so forth. For if you received multiple day units, then whatever your income is, that will be scaled. And I think that's better than just a flat out uniform sort of thing like the United States typically has. I don't think it's enough for for at least two reasons, I should say. On the one hand, it doesn't extend to all kinds of punishment. So it doesn't include things like incarceration and doesn't come with guidance for dealing with that or for adjusting around the different impacts that are involved there. Number two, it's about income specifically, not about wealth. And if there's one thing we've noticed from watching the rich and their tax evasion, they'll find ways to minimize that income and make it look like they earn less than they do. And it also just doesn't account for things like having property, right? You may not earn money that looks like income just because you own stuff, but it may make a difference to your overall status and situation. And so I think more work needs to be done to assess exactly what the correct response to this kind of a thing is. But I think that we have some progress in looking at places like Germany, Finland. I think Australia has at least a limited amount of this sort of fine. I'm not as familiar with the details there, but yes, there's some of it going on in other countries, yes.
Thank you. So instead of reading the questions in the chat, I think what we'll do, if it's okay, is we can just maybe raise our hands. I don't want to filter anyone's voice. And so Miguel, would you like to ask your question?
Hi. Yeah, very interesting. Well, if you can read the questions, they are very long. Zachary.
Okay. Yeah. So probably everyone can see the question in the chat, but Miguel, essentially, I take your question to be, well, look, if we take suggestion number one that I offered and we lower the fines to a lower starting place, namely by starting with we treat our maximum now, say 150 for the speeding ticket, as the total cap, and then we lower it based on people's wealth from there. Doesn't that give us a problem? Because it'll be so low that no one will be motivated to respond to the fine. We'll lose the value of deterrent in punishment. My response to that, I guess, is to say, well, I'm not so sure. It depends on what it is, and I think that's a matter of empirical research. So, for example, with traffic tickets, maybe it's enough of a punishment if you just had to get pulled over and go off to the side. I mean, there are other worries about police and their traffic stops that I'll set to the side for now. But I guess I don't think it's obvious that we should only scale up. I think probably there are at least some areas we punish that we are already punishing way more than we should. And probably what we should do is reconsider those in the first place. But even if we got that initial starting point right, then I think we should scale from there. But we have to be careful not to assume that we're going to lose the value of deterrence. There's a separate problem here, which is it's not really clear that upping punishment actually increases its deterrent value. So for example, you could think about all the research on capital punishment. Doesn't seem to actually reduce crime any more than any other punishment does. Sometimes not at all. And so I think there's some research into things like actually what does implementing this punishment or threat of punishment do to prevent people from doing a crime of some given variety.
Okay, thank you. So for Amin and Amni, why choose Rawls as the leading theorist of critique? Doesn't that framework aggregate a kind of colorblind racism?
Amni, if you're okay with it, I can certainly take that. Yeah, absolutely, Greg. The ideal situation would be to ask some fundamental questions here, to flip the question on its head. Why are we going after Muslim communities for terrorism? Are these communities the assumption being, if they are in fact engaging in terrorism, are they responding to state terrorism? Is what we do to them and what they do to us equivalent? So that's a tougher question to ask, but in light of what we have to deal with, I think from a policy standpoint, it's the best way to approach it. If we are going to look at extremism, and we have been supposedly looking at extremism to the detriment or to the neglect of white supremacist violence, right-wing violence, and so on. In fact, that's been rather defunded for a long time. Let us speak, candidly. If we're going to talk about just theory, let's develop theory in a blind way, and I know that has problematic implications, but let's do so in a way that really tackles everybody's concerns. If, in fact, the issue of concern is violent extremism, period. But that's not the issue. And so you raise a fundamental question here. Are we really tackling violent extremism, or are we really going after particular groups? And that is perhaps something that we should include in the paper. That's our contention. The veils of the ignorant assumes that we're actually going after particular groups. And we've been doing so systematically for a long time.
Okay. Greg, did you have a follow-up to that, or? Okay.
No, thank you very much. It was a great presentation.
Thank you, Greg. Appreciate it.
Zachary, there's a very long question for you. So have you read The Jail, and would you like to respond to that?
I have not read the book The Jail, but I can respond a little bit based on the explanation there in the comment, which is very helpful. Thank you. And I will look at the book The Jail. I've already taken a note of it. Yes, so I think I agree, at least with what I'm seeing here, that just changing the structure of jails, making them better, more humane, I would say is probably a pretty important thing if we think incarceration is justified at all. But it's not enough. We're still going to have these problems that come up in that I'm talking about a little bit in my paper with incarceration and the harms that it does. I'd be curious in reading the book, which I'll have to do, to see how that amounts to an extension of the welfare state. At least intuitively with that language and how I'm used to hearing that used, that would suggest that jails are sort of taking care of the poor, but that's not what jails look like to me. It looks like they're removing the poor, putting them in service to some other thing, such as private prison enterprises or labor in prisons. I mean, I live in Auburn, New York. There's a correctional facility where prison labor is ongoing and is one of the first places that it was sort of re-implemented following some of the policies of Jim Crow. So there's many problems here, I think. And I guess I would avoid characterizing this as a welfare state, but otherwise I think, yeah, we can't just like make prisons nicer and solve the problem. That is for sure.
Mm-hmm. Rachel, you have a follow-up question about Rawls?
Forgive me, if I may, I have a follow-up for Zachary.
Oh, so sorry, please, go ahead.
Just a clarification. No, he does not insinuate that it's a welfare state. He's not putting it in a good context, of course. He's merely suggesting that it's avoiding our responsibility to engage, to become a more egalitarian society. And so we neglect that responsibility by using the jails as a way to sort of, to relegate our responsibility to the criminal justice system. Put these people away, give them 3 meals a day, don't worry about them, out of sight, out of mind. And that's how we deal with essentially the rabble, is his argument.
I see, good. That's a helpful clarification. in that case, I still would add just one further thing, which is yes, but I also think there's a more sinister background to this, which is the prison industrial complex is still functioning on the basis of this, and it's more than just sweeping them away. It's using them to favor other people's ends, the capitalists who run prisons and things like that. But I suspect that Erwin probably would agree to that based on what you said. So thank you.
Okay,
Thank
Rachel?
Hi, yeah, thank you for the paper. And I generally don't think I'm unsympathetic to your project and that there might be some Rawlsian justification for not surveilling people in certain ways. But I was wondering if you're aware of a passage in section 48 of A Theory of Justice where Rawls seems to suggest that the theory of punishment is part of non-ideal theory. And so what comes out of this, or like the experiment and the original position doesn't really apply to non-ideal theory, and so wouldn't apply to these kinds of.
That is very useful to me. I'll have to consider it for the paper, of course. So thank you very much.
Sure, thank you.
Are there any other questions? If not, I have one for Zachary, and I was wondering if you might talk a bit about the role of abolition, right, in the context of your paper, because you mentioned it, but you didn't. You said you didn't really have time, and so there's time now, I think, for you to kind of discuss a bit more the role of abolition. And I'm concerned around just the language of proportional punishment. It just like the phrasing of it doesn't sit well with me, because I feel as though an argument is perhaps being posed that punishment is going to happen. So since it's going to happen, it should be proportional, right? But it doesn't deal with the system of, punishing anyways. Like, do we need to punish? Right? Why punish? So if you could just kind of, yes, address these issues related to abolition. Yeah.
Yes, fantastic question. So the first thing I'll say is I don't want to situate my argument as, well, punishment's going to happen, so let's just do it better or something. I want it to be very, very conditional. If punishment of any kind is justified, then it at least has to make this criteria. But that doesn't mean at all that punishment is justified or that any given one is. And I think that's important because I think there's very real arguments from both prison abolitionists and people who advocate for a restorativist sort of outlook on not punishment, but rather on what do we do when someone transgresses or causes harm. We want to restore them to the community, and we want to restore the person harmed so that they're not put at a disadvantage because of the actions of someone else. Right? And I guess my exact response here is going to depend on which abolitionist or restorativist I'm responding to. So for example, one author, Duff, argues that, well, some of what's required in restoration is that someone willingly would accept to be fined or would willingly give money or something like that. But the actual account that comes out there looks an awful lot like punishment in the terms that we normally use. Whether or not it's framed that way, maybe it's not looked at in sort of this retributivist light that I think punishment normally seems to have cast over it, even in non-retributivist theories. But I think in cases like that, if what's necessary, for example, to restore someone or to allow them to express to allow them or the society to express the value of the victim and themselves be restored as not being the kind of person who would harm or something like that, to get them back into the community morally and to restore the victim back up to a level of equality and not having been impacted unfairly. I think it may still require something like proportionality. And in that case, I totally agree. If it turns out that punishment is either the wrong term or it isn't justified, I fully grant what you've said. I think, though, that doesn't undermine the principle being applicable to cases like that. So, for example, I should put it in terms that are more concrete, I guess. Say someone goes out and they simply, let's make it easy, they take $100. To be restored might not just be giving $100 back. There might be additional harm they did, whether that's psychological damage or something like that. If they're a particularly wealthy person who did this, then to express to the community that they wish to be restored, or that they're repentant for what's been done, or to show that they really do value the victim or something along those lines, they may just need to proportionately give more. Now that may be they give the 100 back, and then there's also something more they need to do beyond that. And we'd have to talk about what those terms look like. But I guess I want to remain neutral on the details because I don't think I'm qualified to spell those out. But I do think in that context it'd be relevant. If by abolition it's just that the 100 is paid back, nothing else, for example, there's literally no further action at all, then I guess it's true my account would have nothing to say there.
Okay, good. Any other questions? I think I could be in this space all day because I do want, I'm like, just maybe like one minor follow-up, right? And so do you tie punishment to lessons at all? And so I always like kind of want to think about like, so what is the lesson that you want the transgressor to learn, right? And so like, is there a pedagogical practice happening here, right? And so I guess like the person in your example of the driving example, okay, so I guess the person who was victimized is the state. And so like there's a problem with setting the state up as, you know, injured party because I drove over the speed limit. So who's the injured party and what am I, and what is the learn, like what am I to learn from having been fined my $45, which I need to do other things with? So yeah.
Good. Yeah, so one response would be, no one's harmed, maybe we shouldn't be doing anything resembling punishment. That seems like one way to go. Another would be to say, because I don't want to say the state's harmed by you driving over the speed limit in some way. I don't buy that. That does not sound right to me at all. But you could say something like, look, what you did that was wrong here was you raised the risk or something. Maybe speeding's not a good example, but or actually maybe it is. Say someone goes blazing through a small neighborhood, 100 miles per hour, no way they could brake in time if a child happened to be there. They don't hit anyone, but maybe what they did wrong was they put a lot of people at a very high level of risk. That's unacceptable. And I guess it seems appropriate, as you put it, to maybe there's a lesson that needs to be learned there. Maybe there's something that should be done to, in some sense, to apologize to the community. I'm not sure a flat fine on its own will do that. There may need to be some further thing, whether that's education, whether that's some discussion. I don't know what that would look like precisely. I think there are other authors who have spelled that out better than I could do off the top of my head. But I guess I would suggest that insofar as anything is owed by them back, or that they should give to express that they've understood something, that's going to still be proportional. But insofar as education alone is sufficient, by all means, I would rather stop there. I don't like over punishing. I think I would rather under punish than over punish, and in most cases at the very least. It seems better to err on that side rather than to do something particularly harmful on top of harm that's already been done. So that's my response, but maybe that wasn't adequate.
Okay, yeah. Well, thank you everyone for joining this session. It was really excellent, and thank you to our presenters. See you all at the next session.
Thank you, Lupe. Thank you for doing a great job. Appreciate it.
Thanks.